Today, I'm going to, of course, talk about mostly I'm going to get into the rise of Napoleon today. I don't know if we get too far into it, but I am going to, of course, talk about the end of the French Revolution. So that's one of my big things I'll get to today. Of course, I'm still using part of that same PowerPoint slide I used before right here. So yeah, we're going to continue talking about the French Revolution. Of course, the big thing we need to talk about is what happened to Robespierre and his Jacobins. Of course, Robespierre, they eventually got overthrown. If you study about it, the Jacobins in July of 1794, they got sick. Pretty much the other factions that were in the National Convention got sick of Robespierre. They went too far with all these radical changes. And eventually they were overthrown, July 1794, which was, of course, in that month of Thermidor, which was one of those months that was part of the French Revolutionary calendar that I talked about before. And at one point, I believe, you study about what happened in the actual assembly, they actually shouted him down, saying, "Down with the tyrant, down with the tyrant." And eventually he was arrested and imprisoned. And I think Robespierre tried to shoot himself initially, tried to kill himself with a pistol, but it failed to kill him. And eventually on July 28th, most of the Committee of Public Safety, the ones we talked about, Fort Robespierre and all that, were all executed via the guillotine. So they think that pretty much ended the whole, reign of terror. And it was kind of seen as this counter-revolution, like a revolution within a revolution, I think some people call it, because it's either called the Thermidorian reaction or the Thermidorian revolution. And so they were overthrown, and the government kind of shifted more toward the middle, the Republican state of France at that point. And that's what led to the so-called French Directory government that would be founded around 1795, and it would be in power for like 4 years or so overall. It was a Republican government. I think I've got a slide on that I can share with you, which is right here, the so-called Directory, it was dubbed. And it included a 5-man council that was part of it. They're like an executive committees that was called directors. That's why it was called the Directory, because of all these men that sat on it. I guess they were kind of concerned about one person having too much power overall. And there was one man named Paul Barras who sat as one of the 5 directors, of course. He probably may have been one of the most powerful ones. And of course, the guy that would later give Napoleon, you see on the bottom there, a chance later, not Napoleon Dynamite, but Napoleon Bonaparte. Yeah, kind of a joke there. And yeah, he later give him, of course, a little help later, of course, coming to power and all of that. And but it was, like I said, it was a Republican type of government, but it was a weak government. Sometimes people didn't really know who was in power. I know when the Americans dealt with, I think, the French Directory government a couple times, they couldn't figure out who was in charge, that kind of thing. So it was kind of seen as kind of being kind of weak. I'll get to Napoleon. Napoleon, I guess, kind of comes, like I said, famous during that time. But the French Directory was actually a little bit, they had an assembly, but it was a little different than the previous ones they had, like the National Convention. They had a bicameral legislature, which I think they called it also the Directory as well. And it had 2 chambers to it. There was one that was called the Council of 500, which was kind of a nickname that they got from the ancient Greeks. The Greeks had some kind of council like that at one point. It was made up of 500 representatives, and this council could like draft all the actual laws of the country. It controlled like revenue, things like that, taxation, and so on. And there was a second body, which was, I guess, the upper chamber, that was called the Council of Ancients. It was the one that could actually reject the laws. So the laws went from one chamber to the next. They would agree to it. And then also the Council of Ancients was important because they're the ones that would actually choose and elect the actual directors, which I think was chosen from a list or something like that they had. So I was kind of talking about, the directory, but like I said, it was a weak government. They did continue the French Revolutionary Wars, which would drag on for like a few more years to about 1802. And Napoleon, at the end of the directory, would have over time would actually become their top general in the French Revolutionary Wars, like especially by the time you get up to like the 1799 and all that. And Napoleon actually at one point it actually saved the directory initially. I think at its Constitutional Convention when it first formed in 1795, and I think without him, I don't know if it would have survived. And so Napoleon later, due to successful military campaigns against Britain and other powers in the French Revolutionary Wars, it made him really popular. Big hero. He was a household name. He had all these campaigns he fought like in Italy and Europe and Egypt. And so later on, it's going to allow Napoleon to eventually seize power in a coup d'etat in 1799. So the phase of the directory is really considered to be like the last period of the whole French Revolution when it comes to an end. So I'll get more into that later about Napoleon and all of that. Let me, of course, I say, yeah, I'll get to that in a second about that. Let me go, of course, continue. Of course, here's a picture of, Napoleon with the directory and all that later. Let me go ahead and review, of course, a little bit, of course, on material that we've already covered. Of course, it says under which French king did the French Revolution break out in 1789? That was Louis XVI. What were some causes of why the French Revolution occurred? Well, obviously, one of them was the decline of the French Empire. France was not a major power like it was before. I get to it later. They also lost a lot of colonies at that time. There was also a lot of inept leadership under Louis XVI. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was also unpopular. What war against Britain did France lose possession of Canada, which is also originally called New France by them, at the Battle of Quebec, also called the Plains of Abraham? That was, of course, the 7 Years' War, which was part of a North American campaign that was called, in America later, French and Indian War. France also lost Louisiana, which was kind of part of New France, and it went to the Spanish. What climatic event may have helped to cause the revolution? Bad harvests. They believe the Little Ice Age played kind of a major role. Climate change that may have led to like shortages of food, etc. What other revolution was supported by the French, which caused considerable debt problems from deficit spending? That was the American Revolution or American Revolutionary War, where the United States fought for independence against the British. So the French backed it, mostly to get back at the British. Who was the famous general who led the American side against the British? Who was later president of the United States? That was George Washington. Who was the unpopular wife and queen of Louis XVI? We just talked about her, but Marie Antoinette. What else? What were the estates? The estates was what they called the main social classes of France, which was divided into 3 subclasses that were first estate, which was the clergy. Second estate was the nobility. Third estate was the common people. What were the main subclasses in the third estate? You had the bourgeoisie, which was the upper middle class. It was often called the culottes. And you had the urban lower class, which was the sans-culottes. So you had those two. The bourgeoisie was more like a kind of a wealthy, educated class that was like the merchants and the people that owned businesses, like in capitalism later. Then you had the peasants on the bottom, like the third one that's in the third estate. Why did the king, which is King Louis XVI, recall the Estates General? The Estates General 1789 was called because the country was going into debt because they owed money. They owed money to creditors, and so they wanted to raise taxes to offset it. That's the thing that really set up the French Revolution. What pamphlet did Abbé Sieyès, who's also known as Emmanuel Sieyès, publish at the beginning of the Revolution that supported the idea of the Third Estate forming a separate assembly? That was what is the Third Estate? What was the assembly called? It was eventually called the National Assembly. It would break away on June 17th, 1789. And they took the tennis court oath on June 20th, 1789, which was the first real instance of the revolution, where they all took an oath to create a constitution of France, the delegates to the National Assembly. What major violent event touched off the beginning of the revolution? July 14th, 1789. That was, of course, the storming of the Bastille, Paris, France. And, of course, that day is still celebrated today in France. And it's called Bastille Day. What was the Great Fear? It was a wave of paranoia, anarchy that occurred after the French Revolution broke out. The revolution spread throughout the country. And then what happened was the National Assembly began making a bunch of reforms. The country, they had the August decrees, abolished like serfdom, tithing, feudalism. They adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. Was also created, which gave everybody equal rights, all Frenchmen. Then what happened was the the Legislative Assembly formed, which later became known as the National Convention. And it got taken over by the Jacobins, who were called the Jacobin Club, which were more liberal or radical factions that were in the French Assembly. And over time, they formed this committee that's called the Committee of Public Safety. And it was the committee that basically controlled the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror, of course, was a period of political repression by the Jacobins, who cracked down on anybody that was against the revolution. Maximilien Robespierre, of course, was the leader of the Jacobins, especially the Montagnards. Because remember, the Jacobins were divided into two main factions, the Mountain, which is called the Montagnards, and then they also have the Girondists. And the Montagnards were more radical, and the Girondists were kind of more moderate. What was the guillotine? What was it named after? Who was it named after? The guillotine was a type of decapitation device that was invented by the French to execute people via beheading, of course. It was named after Joseph Guillotine. He was a French doctor. But everybody called it the National Razor. That was the nickname that a lot of people called it. What radical forms did Robespierre make to France during the Reign of Terror? One, I told you, he developed that French revolutionary calendar or Republican calendar that got rid of, like, the Christian calendar. They got rid of Christianity. They de-Christianized France. They replaced it with a deist cult called the Cult of the Supreme Being. And then I told you about the Thermidorian reaction or revolution. That's when Robespierre and the Jacobins were overthrown. And then the Directory came in. The Directory was a Republican government, of course, that controlled France from 1795 to 1999. It was called the Directory because it had these 5 executive officers called directors that controlled it, including Paul Barras, who was the most famous. And of course, Napoleon was the guy, that eventually rose to power. So that's the next thing, of course, I'm going to talk about next, of course, which I'm going to get into. Now, I'm going to talk about Napoleon and who Napoleon was and all that. Anyway, Napoleon Bonaparte, a little background, of course, on him. Of course, I think I've got different pictures of Napoleon that I can kind of show you. Of course, you can see Napoleon behind me. Of course, that's probably one of his most famous paintings, which is really kind of, what's that painting that I've got behind me, which is right here. It's really the most famous by Jacques Louis David. I think it's the one where he's going through the Alps or something like that. And they split that up if you don't mind. And anyway, kind of go into the early life of Napoleon. Napoleon was born not in France. Like, people don't realize that Napoleon was not French. He was actually Italian. Like, he spoke originally Italian himself. I don't know if he was very good at French as much. He learned to speak French and all that, but he wasn't as good with that compared to Italian. But he was born in Corsica, which was an island in the Mediterranean Sea. That's about when he was born, August 15th, 1769. Napoleon said that in his earlier life that I was born when my country was dying, he said famously. And apparently at the time when he was born, Corsica was annexed by the French. They came in and took it over. And Corsica is still part of France today. Anyway, what happened later, because of him being, born under the French rule and all that, his father, whose name was Carlo Bonaparte, was eventually able to send him to France to be educated in schools there. There was one called Chateaubriand, I think, were the first one that he attended when he was about 9. So he's like 9 years old when he's basically sent to France at a very young age. And of course, he saw France as this foreign, colder type country because, Corsica is more warmer climate, in the Mediterranean Sea. And everybody made fun of course, Napoleon, of course, when he got there. So he moved to France at the age of 9. He later would attend a famous school in Paris that was called the École Militaire, Military Academy of the Bourbons originally. Now it's like the big, I think, military, it's like the West Point of the French military today. So he went there, which I think he graduated real quick, like in a year or two. Graduated in 1784, around 15 or 16 years old. He started out as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. This would be a man that would be really considered to be one of the greatest military geniuses in modern times. Napoleon, a lot of people consider him to be one of the first great modern generals that you had. Later, he acquired a nickname, which was more of a terms of endearment, he was often called the Little Corporal by a lot of his own soldiers. It was more of a terms of endearment. Of course, some claim that Napoleon was short, although that's likely not true about the whole height thing. Of course, later when he became emperor, he was known as also the Little Emperor, the Petit Empereur, or Petit Corporal, which of course is the, French nicknames he was called. Of course, he was called all kinds of nicknames. Napoleon the Great, I think the Corsican, I think may have been another name that he was called. In French measurements, he's actually 5'2", but in like measurements today, it would be more like 5'6". So Napoleon was really considered to be about average height at the time. Although a lot of people thought he was short from two reasons. One is he would often have a lot of bodyguards around him that were much taller, like 6 feet and taller. And so that's why a lot of people thought he was short. And then also from British propaganda, they said he was real short. And so that's basically, where that came from as well. Of course, the British called him Boney or Old Boney or something like that. That's what they dubbed him as well. So Napoleon was considered, like I said, the first major modern general in history. They think he was influenced by other generals' tactics like the Greeks and Romans. I think they say he studied a lot of the ancient warfare. He also studied Frederick the Great. He was he idolized Frederick the Great and some of his tactics. And I think one time when he later conquered Prussia, he once said that if that man was here, Frederick the Great, I wouldn't be here. So I think he thought he was a better general than he was at one point. For years, he's undefeated. I think from I want to say 1796 to 1812, he's undefeated in battle. So for a long 15 years at least, nobody beat him. And he was kind of considered to be, had a lucky star, I guess some people said. And forget his winning average, but I believe it's like 80, it's like almost 90% was the amount of victories he had in battle. I forget what it was. It was 50, around 50, I think 50 some battles. I want to say 52 battles he fought in or something like that. He lost very few battles, Napoleon. Of course, at the end of his life, he lost the ones that were important, like Waterloo, et cetera. They were strategic, et cetera. But Napoleon was like the Nick Saban of, military generals. So probably the greatest general of all time. You look at the victories he had. All right. Let me also talk about a few other things about Napoleon as well. Of course, I've got other slides in here if you want to look at them later. There's, of course, slides about his early life if you want to look at that. He first became a general under the French in 1793. Now, there was a battle, or really called the Siege of Toulon, which was part of the French Revolutionary Wars, where the British came in and tried to take over the port of Toulon. It's on the Mediterranean Sea. And Napoleon came up with a tactic to take the heights and shoot cannon, basically, artillery at the British fleet and forced them out. So from that, he became brigadier general. Then in 1795, he became full general. He was only 26. And there was I don't know if you know how he became full general, but there was a story where the Directory was having its constitutional convention, and a bunch of royalists tried to march on it because they wanted to put the king back in. And he got out some cannon and he blasted them with like cannon, basically. And he said that later on they joked that he used a whip of grape shot to break up the riots, whatever. And so after that, he was like full general, pretty much Napoleon. Let me also talk about as well his wife as well. I need to get into, which was Josephine. I need to mention about her. Napoleon had two wives that he married. He had a bunch of mistresses and girlfriends as well, Napoleon. But his first wife in love was Josephine de Beauharnais. I believe I've got a picture of her, a couple pictures I've got. I can show you. Where is she? I think she's right there's the main one. I guess I'll give you right there. They believe that Josephine was this. She was a French Creole woman who was born in the Caribbean. Actually, originally, she came back to France. Her husband died on the guillotine. And apparently for a while, she was the mistress of Paul Barras, believe it or not. But Paul Barras, I guess, got tired of her, and Josephine then became the lover of Napoleon. Later on, he asked her to marry her. And of course, he married her in 1796. And she went on to be was Empress consort later when Napoleon, of course, became king. That should be 1804, I guess, 1809, I guess, really there. But basically, became his first Empress consort. He had two of them, of course, another wife later, I'll mention too. But she never really loved him. That's something that a lot of people don't know about Napoleon and Josephine. She really didn't like the guy. In fact, she cheated on him a bunch of times, apparently. And Napoleon had a bunch of mistresses. I forget how many girlfriends did Napoleon have. He had something like, how many was it? 28 mistresses or girlfriends or something like that he had at one point. He had a lot. He had a bunch of illegitimate kids, supposedly, as well. Oh, his other, I'll mention her briefly here. He had a second wife later. He married Marie Louise, who was from Austria. She was actually related to Marie Antoinette. I believe she was, I want to say a niece or a niece of Marie Antoinette. And he married her because he wanted to have a lineage, and he needed like a son, to continue later when he became emperor, because he wanted to start his own dynasty. And so she had like a son with him, which was Napoleon II. They later called him She was empress consort for a few years after that. And I think she really actually liked Napoleon and not Josephine. So God is kind of getting into talking about the early life, of course, of Napoleon and all of that. Now, let me get into and talk about some of the campaigns of Napoleon that really made him popular and all of that. The first big campaign they always talk about was the Italian campaign that happened between 1796 and 97. And Napoleon commanded his actual first real army. He hadn't done anything. I think he was mostly just general of the interior or something like that in France at the time after the Directory formed. And they believe Paul Barras is the one that gave him this commission. Although the joke was, if you know about this among some of his troops, was that it was really because of his wife. His wife knew Paul Barras, and so she helped him get all these commissions. They think that's how he rose to power, because of a woman, that kind of thing. So he rebuilt this army. Of course, he crossed into the Alps and all that, and he took on two states, which were, you can see there, Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia, which was also called Piedmont, which is actually located in the northwestern part of Italy. His forces routed both of those forces. And the Austrians didn't really know what to do with Napoleon. Napoleon was just basically this guy that fought new tactics that they'd never seen before. He'd flank them left and right. He'd attack them in the rear. He'd fight when it was raining. He'd fight at night. He'd fight in the winter. So they'd never seen that. And then if a general was in check, usually a general would back off. No, he wouldn't. He'd keep coming at him and all that. So Charlie knew kind of warfare Napoleon fought. And eventually, because of it, the French were able to drive out Austria out of Italy, northern Italy. And basically, the French took control of northern Italy. And Napoleon later would take Italy and he would form a state out of it that would later be called the Kingdom of Italy, which he would actually rule over it at one point. And the Treaty of Campo Formio, of course, which finalized the treaty that ended that conflict with Austria and also the Piedmont Sardinia state, was actually written up by Napoleon himself. Believe it or not, dictated pretty much to him, that kind of thing. Right, then they had, of course, the other conflict, other event that was very famous that Napoleon, of course, was well known for, and that's his famous Italian campaign where Napoleon invaded Egypt. And it's kind of a bizarre part of, I guess, Napoleon's military career, but it was, I think, the idea of the French Directory government to try and knock the British out of the war. The British were still one of the major powers that was still fighting the French in the French Revolutionary Wars. And the idea was to try to take over Egypt and knock the British out of the war by disconnecting their trade routes. I think there was even an idea to, if they could take Egypt, maybe they could somehow march east and maybe take over India or something. He's thinking like, oh man, Alexander the Great, here marching eastward and all. And the campaign would last about close to around 2 years or so, with how long it would be. And his army was called different names. They usually call it the Army of the Orient. That's one of the names they called it. So his idea was to conquer part of Asia, I think, initially, later on. Well, Napoleon landed his forces sometime in the summer of 1798. They think his troops had maybe about, I want to say, around 35,000 troops. And Egypt was kind of part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was actually controlled by these mercenaries of the Turks. They were called the Mamluks. You may have heard of them. They were mostly fought on horseback using cavalry still at the time. And Napoleon's forces were just too advanced for the Mamluks to really do anything to stop Napoleon's forces. And Napoleon's forces basically in July of 1798 routed them Napoleon actually formed his forces into huge squares with infantry, and I think also with use of artillery. And the battle of pyramids, as they called it, which was fought near Cairo, was just totally lopsided. They got very few casualties. And from that, the French were able to basically seize control of Egypt at that point. From there, Napoleon, if you know about it, began making some reforms to Egypt afterwards. And he even brought a lot of people with him. Like he brought a lot of these scientists, engineers, historians, artists, and other people to study about ancient Egypt, because he was really interested about what kind of mysteries existed in the past about Egypt. And he thought they could learn that Europe or the modern world could learn something from it. And they think that a lot of what Napoleon did, going into Egypt, in a sense, started modern Egyptology. Of course, it also led to a lot of fortune hunters coming later that would take a lot of stuff that's in Egypt and bring it back to Europe, which the French and British and others did, over time. There, of course, was one famous story, which, of course, is well known about Napoleon, Egypt, and that was the famous discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone was actually the stone that was found in 1799 in the Nile Delta area of Egypt, like in northern Egypt. It's found actually in a fort. It was actually in the wall. It was a half-ton stone that a French officer found named, I guess the full name is Pierre Francois Bouchard. I think he was a French, I want to say engineer officer, discovered it, and he was like, hey, what's this? It was a black basalt stone. You can see the size of it right there on the bottom. It weighed about half a ton, like 1,000 pounds, I think is what it was, they believe. And it actually was an inscription on it, which talked about one of the kings of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which I believe was King Ptolemy V. And it was written in like 3 languages, which were, if you want to know the 3 languages, it was hieroglyphs, a cursive form of hieroglyphs called demotic, in Greek. And that stone would be important later because eventually they figured out how to translate it. And then from there, it became this decipher key in rediscovering hieroglyphs, the Egyptian language, because at the time it was dead. It was a dead language. Nobody could read it. And there was actually a Frenchman that figured out how to translate it in 1822, I think it was the year, named Jean-Francois Champollion. That should be an M, by the way, C-H-A-M, typo there. But anyway, so of course later the British would defeat Napoleon in Egypt, and the Turks, I think, kicked him out later. And of course, the stone ended up in Britain. It's now in the British Museum in London. Let me talk about, of course, one more thing that also happened in Egypt as well. Of course, he got trapped there. If you know about Napoleon, his forces got trapped in Egypt. What happened was the French Navy discovered where the French fleet was in what is the delta of the Nile, Albuquerque Bay, I believe it is. And it led to the famous Battle of the Nile, which was fought between the French Navy and the British Navy, which was led by, you see there, Lord Nelson, also later called Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was, by the way, the greatest naval commander on the British side in the war. And Napoleon's, most of his fleet was destroyed in the battle. So it kind of left him trapped there because of it. So it was a total fiasco, of course. And so Napoleon basically had to stay in Egypt to try, survive there, without supplies for a while, I guess, until later, when more naval forces came later. But he did try to do something that's very interesting. He did try to invade to the east to seize part of the Ottoman Empire's territory in what is Syria at the time, I think they called it, which is now called Israel or Palestine. And some of his forces at one point seized control, or they tried to seize control of Accra, which is in the northern part of Israel today. And Napoleon had this crazy idea at the time, which was to create a Jewish state. Like if he could conquer that whole area, maybe the Jews could live there. So yeah, actually he was one of the first that actually came up with the idea in modern times before it became more popular in the 1800s, believe it or not. Napoleon was not a very big religious guy. And he didn't really care much about religion, overall. So what happens after that? Well, Napoleon then would return to France eventually in 1799, and he actually returned a hero, even though I think he was kind of seen as a loss what happened in Egypt because his fleet was destroyed and wasn't able to expand further, like to the east into part of Asia at that point. Napoleon was a master of propaganda. He used propaganda a lot to make himself better than what he was, I guess, militarily in this campaign. And so what happened when he got back, which was like in late 1799, I want to say close to maybe October, I guess may have been, he conspired with members of the Directory to overthrow the government and take control of the state in a coup d'etat. And of course, what happened was it was called, I don't know if they have the original name up there, but it was called the Coup of 18 Brumaire. That's usually the nickname for the coup when he would seize power, take over France. The date was actually November 9th, 1799. And with that, him taking over Napoleon, it did several things. One, it started a new historical period. Historians often call it later, which is the age of Napoleon, which would last about around 15 years, up to about 1815, roughly. And of course, the age of Napoleon, I'll get more into later, was subdivided. They had two periods that were kind of in it. They had the French consulate period, or sometimes called the consulate for short, which went from 1799 to 1805. Then later, I'll get to it later, they have another period that's the Napoleonic Empire, which will go from 1800. That really should be 1804. It's probably what it should be, really. But the some people they think the empire doesn't really start until 1805. But then the empire after that, of course, till 1850. I think that's a typo on that. But anyway, so yeah, let me first talk about for a few minutes about the French consulate. I'll get into that and cover that a little bit about that. So Napoleon would actually rule as consul first. The French consul was like a Republican type government of France that would rule for about 4 or 5 years, and it's kind of influenced by like some of the influence like from the Romans and the Greeks a little bit. I know the Romans had the Roman consul, that idea, and so he kind of came up with that idea, and he helped develop the Constitution, which was originally called the actual constitution he created originally was called the Constitution of Year 8, which came out around 1800, roughly, I think when it was finalized. And with him taking power, a lot of people see it as the end of the French Revolution. So Napoleon, like I said, is the end of the French Revolution when he takes control of the country and starts the French consulate. And his real title was First Consul of France, which was kind of similar to like Julius Caesar, more or less. And eventually he was made consul for life in 1802. Of course, he's made consul for life. They actually have a plebiscite or referendum where he's basically given it permanently, that position. There were 2 other consuls that ruled with him, but they were really like figureheads. And so Napoleon's time in power at that time is kind of viewed as a Republican state, but many in Europe kind of saw it as like a dictatorship, backed up by the military, more or less. But basically, it was still, the whole French Revolutionary Wars kind of keep going, and they, continue to like 1802, more or less. All right. So like I said, Napoleon's taken over the country at that point. Overall, the French Revolution's over. There was a statement I did want to, of course, mention about Napoleon, of course, which is well known, is that Napoleon once said about the end of the revolution that I am the revolution. And of course, we will. We'll get into that. We'll talk about the fact that Napoleon, wasn't just this general. He was this man that was kind of seen as being enlightened. He would believe in reforms to the state to try to change France, to try to modernize France. And that's one of the things that Napoleon becomes known for, is his reforms that he starts to put into power under the French consulate at the time. So I want to talk about some of the reforms of Napoleon that were, of course, well known. Those are kind of a list of things that he kind of did when he was, of course, the ruler of France. I'll give you a bunch of them. There's like a ton of things that Napoleon did that were famous. I think they say at the beginning, one of the first things that Napoleon did was he created a Bank of France. They call it the National Bank of France, or the Banque de France, which I think is the French name, usually spelled Banque. And it was formed around 1800. It's like one of the first things he did. So he nationalized the bank. He balanced the budget of France, which hadn't been balanced in a while. He stabilized the French currency under him. He also allowed the Catholic Church to come back, which had been kicked out, going back to the Jacobins, which was done in 1801. There was an agreement made with the Pope at the time, whose name is Pope Pius VII, and it was called the Concordat of 1801. And so it made the Catholic religion the main religion of France at the time, but it wasn't the only religion. They had to, allow freedom of religion in the country, and so any religion can be practiced, I think, pretty much in France and still today overall. Of course, his most famous reform, you see there, the Napoleonic Code, something that he's real big on overall. And that was established in 1804, right before he became emperor. And it was called the Napoleonic Code. It's called, of course, gave him his name, which is the Code Napoleon. And it basically was based off of several ideas. They believe it was based off of the principles of the French Revolution, the ideas of democracy, liberty, equality, the Age of Enlightenment. They believe it was also influenced by the Justinian Code, which had been around since the Byzantine Empire. A lot of legal codes in Europe, like in Germany, Austria, and other countries, were starting to develop their codes kind of like that. I think Frederick the Great had already kind of developed his own code, which was kind of similar to this code later the French developed. And this code was later transported all over the place. It went like all over Europe. Louisiana was influenced by the Napoleonic Code, still is today. And so it's his biggest legacy. Pretty much the law codes of France today are all based on the Napoleonic Code. I do sometimes mention it. He did popularize the metric system. That's something they kind of mention about sometimes as well. France began to adopt that at the time, which was a rival measurement to the British imperial system, which used the foot and the pound, which he actually didn't like it. I think maybe he was shorter under that one. Maybe that's why. I didn't mention, I forgot on the bottom there, the Legion of Honor was something that he also developed, Napoleon. The Legion of Honor was this merit system that he developed in the country, which is still around today. It was a merit system to honor people that have had good service to the country, whether it be civilians or it be military as well. Under this honor system, you could obtain like medals, ranks, even a type of pay, like a type of, I think, money reward that you could get from it. And I think they have like the main medal. I forget what's the medal called that they have that they wear. I don't know if I can remember what it is exactly, but I know that the president of France is considered the highest ranking officer in the Legion of Honor. I thought I wrote that down somewhere. Oh, there it is. It's called Grand Master. That's the highest rank. And the Grand Cross, that's the name of the medal. Napoleon usually wears it sometimes. You'll see in some paintings he's wearing the Grand Cross medal, all that. So Napoleon was this great reformer. You know, he was just a military guy. And so totally changed Europe forever, like that short video I showed you at the beginning of this lecture today. He changed Europe forever. And Napoleon was this man that came from like almost nothing. He was a nobody. You know, pretty much nobody heard of Napoleon, you know, before this, all that. Then, of course, one of the crowning achievements, of course, of Napoleon's life, if you know about it, was, of course, Napoleon was eventually crowned emperor of France. That's one of the big things, of course, that occurred. And that happened in 1804. He becomes, of course, crowned emperor. December 2nd, 1804 is actually when he's crowned emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral, the one in Paris, you know, the one that burned last year. Yeah, that's where he was crowned. Most monarchs, you know, weren't crowned there in France. Like very few have been actually crowned in that actual. There's two Notre Dames. There's one at Reims where all the kings were crowned, and then he was crowned in the one at Paris. When he gets crowned, it's kind of controversial. There's different reasons for that. One, of course, some said that he, you know about it, crowned himself. If you know about that, there's a ceremony where the Pope goes to put the crown on his head, and he grabs it and puts it on his own head, and he crowns his wife, Josephine, as his empress consort. But that was all planned. He was going to do that. And when he becomes, you know, emperor, it's all done in a referendum. You know about this. There's a huge election in 1804 where they have a plebiscite, and majority of the people, like I want to say 90-something percent, it was like 97%, I think what it was, actually voted yes. There was like 3.5 million voted yes, and only a few thousand voted against it, which I guess, I don't know if it was a rigged election or not. It must have been pretty, you know, if it was that lopsided, he must have been pretty popular. And so this empire would form afterwards, which was called different names. People either call it the Empire of Napoleon or Napoleonic Empire from 1804, about 1804, 1805, I think it's kind of debate when it starts. And it goes up to 1814, 1815. So it's around like 10, 11 years. The Napoleonic Empire. It does have two other names. They later call it the first French Empire, because there's a second French Empire. Because Napoleon's got a nephew later named Emperor Napoleon III that reigns as well. And Napoleon liked to call it the Grand Empire, which meant great empire, the great empire of Napoleon. But the first two, Napoleonic Empire or First French Empire, are quite commonly the main names they usually call it. When he was crowned, he was almost dressed up like Caesar, like Julius Caesar, the way he's looking on the right there. And then, of course, I got this other one right here, another famous painting that was done right here. There, of course, you see you've got Empress Josephine, his consort. Of course, she gets crowned also as well at that time. So she becomes eventually in 1805 the Empress consort of Napoleon. So anyway, so that's basically the beginning of the French, you know, empire at that point. Now, I've got a few minutes. I'll just not much time left, I guess. With it. At least I have my lecture around an hour. But let me go ahead and just talk a few more little things about Napoleon and what happened, of course, with him getting crowned at the end of 1804. Well, Napoleon Bonaparte with him being crowned, what it does is it basically caused a series of wars to break out. They're usually called the Napoleonic Wars, which kind of start, they think, around 1803, 1804. They last about 10, 12 years. Very bloody. In fact, some of the bloodiest conflicts in Europe before World War I. In fact, 19th century doesn't have too many bloody wars that are fought. This one, I think, had like 3 million soldiers that would get killed in the war. France faced multiple coalitions that fought against him, which you can see there. Britain was one of the main powers that really opposed Napoleon. Without Britain, I don't know if the coalitions would have been able to stay together. They're the ones that were pretty much back in the whole alliances against Napoleon, using a lot of their money in the British Empire and their navy. Russia got involved, Prussia got involved, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, a few other countries also fought too against like Napoleon. Spain for a while was kind of allied with France also as well. But like I said, it was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Europe until World War I, which World War I was like, I think 9 million soldiers died in that war, in comparison. Napoleon would go on to form an army which became famous during the Napoleonic Wars. You may have heard of it. It was called the Grand Army, or the Great Army of Napoleon. It was considered one of the first great modernized armies in Europe. And it may have peaked at about 800,000 troops. It's pretty huge for that time. And his armies, by the way, were the Grand Army was unbeatable for a bunch of years, or at least I want to say 7 or 8 years. It was unbeatable. And his artillery was like really good. That's actually, they say, part of why the armies were so, the infantry wasn't that great, because the muskets weren't that accurate, but his artillery was supposedly excellent, and that played a major role in a lot of his battles. And part of why he was able to build this army up, the Grand Army, was because of the fact that Napoleon had acquired Louisiana from the Spanish in 1800. He was thinking of maybe trying to conquer part of the New World, like the British, are part of the New World. However, what happened, if you know about it, was Haiti fell. Haiti, there was a Haitian revolt, if you know about that, where the Haitians revolted. And so he was forced to basically sell Louisiana. And so in 1803, he sold Louisiana to the United States under President Jefferson's administration for $15 million. And it became known as the Louisiana Purchase, something we kind of know about in Louisiana, which is where we're at. So he used that money to build this army up. And so from that, he was able to go on to eventually conquer parts of Europe. And so Napoleon, for a while, at one point conquered a good chunk of Europe. He's one of the last to do that. Him and Hitler, I think, and Stalin, some of the last ones that really conquer a lot of territory in Europe in modern times. But later we'll see that Napoleon's not the villain like Hitler is. These wars killed a lot of people, but I think these wars changed a lot of things in Europe later, helped to modernize it and all that. And I'll probably stop here for today, but of course later on Thursday, I'll wrap up talking about the age of Napoleon. I'll kind of go into and get more into what happens with Napoleon, because his empire eventually, develops and it collapses real quick. And then I'll talk about, I should have time to kind of review that period. And maybe if we have time, we can kind of go into the post-Napoleon period in Europe as well. So that's it for today. Don't forget, by the way, about assignments. I've posted, I think you still got that one on England that's still open on British history. So don't forget about that. And I do have some upcoming Canvas quizzes that I'll talk about on Thursday. There's going to be 2 of them, one on a video documentary I'll give you. And also, since we're finishing this period soon, the French Revolution and Napoleon, there's going to be a Canvas quiz on that too as well. So that's it for today. I hope y'all are doing okay this week and all that. So I'll see you later this week with another lecture on Thursday. So take care, y'all. And send me, by the way, any comments too. So I'm gonna post this course later to my YouTube channel. So you take care and see you later.